20th July 1969, the lunar module of the Apollo 11 mission landed on the moon. Astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were in it. After the landing, and Neil Armstrong tried to open the door to get down on the moon. It wasn't easy opening this door due to high pressure, but he successfully opened it after a little struggle. Then he tried to get down to the moon in his heavy spacesuit. The exit wasn't spacious. So by mistake, he hit the top and a piece of the lunar module broke off. Neither of them was aware of this because of the lack of air. The sound didn't travel. They didn't hear any sound. But this broken piece was very crucial. It was the ascent engine arming switch. Without this switch, their lunar module couldn't take off again, and they couldn't return to Earth. Unaware of this, Neil Armstrong got out and stepped on the moon's surface. He became the first man to step on the moon. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But did it actually happen? Today, more than 50 years later, many people refuse to believe that humans had gone to the moon. People cook up theories of their own to claim that the entire Apollo 11 mission was a farce put up by America, that they filmed the scenes on Earth and lied to the world. How else do you explain the flag fluttering without air? What's the truth to it? Come, let's try to understand this story. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. The Eagle has landed. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Friends, you'd be surprised to know the real reason why the Apollo 11 mission was planned was a war, specifically speaking. The Cold War, fought between America and the Soviet Union. Both countries were engaged in a space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union became the first country to launch the first artificial satellite. It was named Sputnik, and it was the first man-made object to be placed in Earth's orbit. The American government was shocked to see the Soviets getting ahead. Months later, in 1958, America launched their satellite as well. But 3 years later, in 1961, America got another shock. Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin was the first person to go to space. The Soviets beat America once again. 1 week later, the then President of America, John F. Kennedy, wrote a letter to the Vice President dated 20th April 1961. He asked the Vice President how they could beat the Soviet Union. By putting a laboratory in space, or by a trip around the moon. Are we working 24 hours a day on existing programs? If not, why not? Are we making the maximum effort? Asking if there was another space program that could be achieved quickly, that would produce dramatic results and give them a lead in the race. He got the answer some days later because he soon realized that the next big step would be to send humans to the moon. On 25 May 1961, in his famous speech, he promised the world that he would send humans to the moon before the end of the decade. Not only this, he also promised to get the humans back on Earth safely. Before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. For many, this was an unbelievable announcement. Friends, imagine 1961. There were no smartphones, no internet. There wasn't even GPS technology. The computers were so slow and old. In such times, he was promising to send humans to the moon. For this, over the next 5 years, he provided $9 million in additional funding to the space program. The entire space agency was engaged in fulfilling this one aim. Mere months later, the tests began. First, they tested the rocket that would be used to leave the Earth. Then the heat shields of the command modules were tested. How much they'd be able to resist heat. Then the propulsion system of the service module. Between 1963 to 1967, many unmanned tests were carried out. The rockets didn't carry any humans during the tests. In February 1967, they planned the first manned tests, a test in which astronauts will go up to space in the rockets. This was the Apollo 1 mission. But during the tests on Earth, on 27 January 1967, the cabin caught on fire, and the 3 astronauts preparing to go to space died in the fire. After this painful event, NASA didn't lose courage. Instead, it continued further testing. Apollo 4, Apollo 5, and Apollo 6 were all unmanned missions for further testing. In October 1968, Apollo 7 mission was launched, and once again they attempted to send humans to space. This was successful. Only 2 months later, in December 1968, Apollo 8 mission was launched, in which 3 astronauts were sent near the moon. 3 months later, in March 1969, the Apollo 9 mission was launched. In this, the lunar module was tested, the part of the spacecraft that was actually going to land on the moon. And 2 months after that, in May 1969, was the Apollo 10 mission. In this mission, 3 astronauts had to do almost everything for practice that was supposed to be done in the Apollo 11 mission, except actually landing on the moon. Look at the speed with which NASA was launching the missions one after the other. In the gap of 2 to 3 months, a new mission to test the next thing. Testing the rockets, spacecraft, going to the moon. And after all these tests, finally, on 16 July 1969, the Apollo 11 mission was launched. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff of Apollo 11. 3 astronauts were a part of this mission. 38-year-old Commander Neil Armstrong. He led this mission. The pilot of the command module, Michael Collins, and the pilot of the lunar module, Edwin Buzz Aldrin. These 3 names are inscribed in the pages of history. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin become famous names. Everyone knows them today. But Michael Collins isn't very popular. The reason for this is very interesting. I'll tell you later in this video. The spacecraft of this Apollo 11 mission had 3 main parts: the command module, service module, and the lunar module. The first 2 are collectively known as CSM, Command and Service Module. They aim to detach the lunar module and have it land on the moon. And to return, the lunar module would have to be launched and attached to the CSM to enable the astronauts to return to Earth. To launch this spacecraft, a Saturn V5 rocket was to be used. Before the launch, the rocket was loaded with 1 million gallons of kerosene, liquid oxygen, and liquid hydrogen. The weight of this rocket was 3 million kg. With its help, the spacecraft reached Earth's orbit. It took less than 10 minutes to reach orbit. Then they made about 1.5 revolutions around the Earth, after which they were given the permission from the mission control. The mission control was of course based on Earth. They communicated their permission to begin translunar injection, taking the spacecraft out of Earth's orbit and towards Moon's orbit. To leave Earth's orbit, the Saturn V5 rocket was used. This was the 3rd stage for the rocket. These events took place within 5 hours of the launch, but to actually reach the moon, it took several days. Astronauts waited in the spacecraft, ate, slept, and took pictures of themselves and their surroundings. 19th July 1969, after traveling for almost 400,000 kilometers, the Apollo 11 spacecraft reached the moon's orbit. Here, it was supposed to be split into 2. The command and service module separated from the lunar module. Michael Collins was in the command module. This part of the spacecraft was nicknamed Columbia, and the lunar module was nicknamed the Eagle. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were in it. The thing is that the command and service module was tasked to remain in the moon's orbit. Only the lunar module was going to land on the moon. It meant that only Armstrong and Aldrin had the chance to step on the moon, and not Michael Collins. Perhaps this is the reason why not many people know Michael Collins. Even though he was a part of the Apollo mission, he did not step on the moon. But even so, Michael Collins' part in this mission was perhaps the most important, because the lunar module was supposed to be reattached to the CSM. Without Michael Collins, Armstrong and Aldrin could not have returned safely. Around 8 p.m., the lunar module was going to land on the moon. Exactly at 8:10 p.m., alarms went off. Neither Armstrong nor Aldrin knew the meaning of this alarm. They asked the mission control what they ought to do next. Mission control tells them to ignore it and keep going. We're GO. Same type, we're GO. Later, they figured out that 1202 was a warning. The processing system of the guidance computer of the Apollo was overloaded, but thankfully, the computer was designed in a way that the essential programs which were critical for the mission would continue despite being overloaded. The computer was installed with the program for automatic landing. This would automatically land the lunar module on the moon's surface. But at the height of 150 meters, Neil Armstrong took over the control. He noticed that the lunar module was going to land at a place where huge boulders were strewn about. The landing spot was changed then, and they decided on another spot 4 miles from the predetermined landing spot. For the actual landing, at 8:16 p.m., Buzz Aldrin checked the fuel indicator. Only 5% fuel remained. 5%. Okay. Seeing the low level of fuel, the mission control initiated the countdown. The countdown to decide whether they should land or abort the mission. Now we're at a critical fuel state. And that's why the 60-second call is given, and then the 30-second call. Finally, literally at the last minute, with only 30 seconds remaining in this countdown, Neil Armstrong sent a radio message to Earth. The Eagle had successfully landed. Then Neil Armstrong put on his spacesuit, opened the door, and stepped on the moon. This moment was watched by 650 million people on television. His first words were televised to the world. Buzz Aldrin followed him on the moon's surface, and for the next 2.5 hours, they collected samples of the moon's dust and rocks, took photographs, set up several scientific instruments as well. Although it is true that the Cold War was a big reason for this moon landing, but because the moon landing was already planned, it was such a huge achievement, so obviously they were carrying scientific instruments with them. There were several scientific objectives of this mission as well. They set up a television camera on the moon to transmit signals to the Earth. They took a device with them to measure the solar winds reaching the moon. They installed a device to send laser beams to the Earth, so that the laser beams could be used to compute the exact distance between Earth and moon. They also had a passive seismometer to measure the earthquakes on the moon. Of course, they're called moonquakes. They collected 23 kilograms of rock and dust from the moon, and they left behind an American flag and a plate with the inscription, "Here, men from the planet Earth first set foot upon the moon." July 1969 AD, the lunar module had to remain on the moon for 21 hours. After this, it had to take off once again and attach to the CSM. But to go up, they needed propulsion. And for that, they needed an engine. Both Armstrong and Aldrin were unaware that the switch to turn on the engine had broken off while they were getting out. I told you this at the beginning of the video. When they came back to the lunar module, they realized what had happened. They informed the mission control about this damage and looked for a solution to resolve the situation. They come up with an interesting solution to the problem. Now, what exactly is a switch? Switch basically works to complete an electrical circuit. Buzz Aldrin realized that if the circuit is broken, they looked for something that could be used to complete the circuit once again. When he looked around, he noticed his ballpoint pen. He used that ballpoint pen to complete the circuit and to reignite the engine. Finally, the lunar module was reattached to the CSM, and the 3 astronauts turned the spacecraft towards Earth. The plan for landing on Earth was that the command module and the service module would be separated. The service module would then be destroyed due to Earth's atmosphere. But there was a danger that if the service module was damaged severely, with its debris floating all around, they may hit the command module, killing the astronauts on board. To avoid this, NASA installed thrusters in the service module to take it far from the command module so that they do not collide with each other. But when the astronauts were returning to Earth, they found out that the thrusters on the service module weren't working. The 3 astronauts could only sit in the command module and watch the service module break apart around them. Its debris was floating all around them. It was a miracle that the broken pieces did not hit the command module. And the command module remained safe. The risk of the astronauts dying on this mission was so high that the U.S. President Nixon had prepared an alternate speech in case the astronauts were indeed killed. Can you imagine an alternate speech? In it, he had written, "Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know that there is no hope for their recovery. These 2 men are laying down their lives in mankind's most noble goal, the search for truth and understanding." But thankfully, this wasn't needed. The command module safely descended the Earth's atmosphere, the parachutes were deployed, and it landed in the ocean. All 3 astronauts were alive and safe. These astronauts were then evacuated by rescue ships from the ocean. It was truly a miracle that they could return alive. It wasn't that the mission had gone exactly as it was planned. They had to face problems at almost every step. They successfully dealt with the problems, and they could return alive. It is interesting to note that after returning, the 3 astronauts were quarantined for 2 weeks. They weren't allowed to be in contact with other humans because of the risk of them carrying pathogens, viruses or bacteria that they might have encountered on Moon that could possibly wreak havoc on Earth. No one knew for sure, but again, thankfully, nothing of the sort happened. Apollo 11's moon landing was the top news in newspapers worldwide. The U.S. President Kennedy's promise of having humans land on the moon before the end of the decade was made possible by NASA. In 1969, the public had little reason to question mankind's historic first step on the moon. After all, the achievement was a celebration of technological supremacy. America had finally won the space race. Isn't it very suspicious that the decade that was about to end in 1970, a year before that, in 1969, America had reached the moon? It can't be that to have an advantage in the Cold War, America planned a fake moon landing operation, can it? And the third was the moon landing. The Soviet Union had actually acknowledged this. But then, what about the flag? The flag which was planted on the moon. Why was it fluttering? There is no air on the moon. There is a simple reason for that, friends. The flag that Armstrong and Aldrin had taken to the moon was a specially designed flag. Normal flags have one long vertical rod, but there was a horizontal rod in this too, right at the top of the flag, so that the flag would always be extended out. Because everyone working at NASA knew that if a flag is planted on the moon, it wouldn't flutter due to the lack of wind. So they decided to add a horizontal rod at the top so that the flag could always be properly visible. But on this Apollo 11 mission, there were some problems extending this horizontal rod, so this couldn't be extended till the end, which caused the ripple that we see. There were waves in the flag. That's why people think that the flag is fluttering. But actually, the flag isn't fluttering. You can see the flag fluttering only in the videos where the astronauts are holding it and making it move. The reason for this is that the aluminum rods in the flag were acting as springs, so the flag would move for a little while and then remain still. That their actual moon landing mission failed, and they planned this fake mission as backup for the world to see. Friends, this is just one example of the many conspiracy theories that is based on the moon landing. But friends, the truth is that these conspiracy theories have already been debunked several times. If this was a fake attempt by America to fool the world, the Soviets would never have acknowledged it. But in the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, published between 1970 to 1979 in its third edition, this moon landing was said to be factual multiple times. Soviet articles have even been written that the Apollo landing was the third historic event of the space age. First was Sputnik's launch in 1957, second, Yuri Gagarin's flight in 1961. The third most popular theory is that in the photos taken by Armstrong and Aldrin, stars aren't visible. The answer to this is very simple. The moon landing took place in the day, at a time when the sunlight was hitting the moon, and the white spacesuits that were worn by the astronauts were very reflective too. The cameras back then didn't have such resolution to see beyond reflections. Even today, take any phone's camera and try to take a pic at night. If the flash is turned on, you won't see the stars in the background. Another theory is about the shadows, about the inconsistency in the angles of the shadows. People argue that since this was like a Hollywood film, they didn't have just a single source of light. That's why the shadows are going all over the place. But in reality, the sun was not the only source of light. The moon's surface was also acting as a complementary source of light, because it was reflecting so much light. This is why the light scattered in all directions, and the shadows were so bizarre. Another question is raised about Buzz Aldrin's photo taken by Neil Armstrong. It shows Armstrong's reflection, but you can see a camera in his hand. How could this happen? It's because he wasn't holding the camera in his hand. Instead, the camera was mounted on his suit, and he could control it from there. But then who took the photos of Neil Armstrong descending from the lunar module? Again, a simple answer: multiple cameras were installed on the lunar module. But moving beyond these mindless theories, if we talk about actual criticism, friends, not everyone was applauding the moon landing, commending NASA's work. Many people strongly criticized NASA and the American government after the moon landing. People were already criticizing it before the moon landing. In January 1962, the New York Times published an article in which they revealed that the money being spent to go on the moon could have been used to build at least 120 Harvard-sized universities. They questioned whether so much money should be spent to go to the moon, or should they open a Harvard-sized university in every U.S. state? Weren't there better ways to spend that money? Basically, the main point of criticism was that there were so many problems in the country: education, income inequality. Back then, America was also facing the consequences of the Vietnam War. So why was so much money wasted on this? But in reality, there were many hidden benefits of the moon landing that no one had even thought about, such as the advancements in computer chips. In 1962, it had been 3 years since microchips were invented, and IBM had decided that in the early 1960s, they wouldn't use these chips in their computers. It has the packaged integrated circuit. Inside this package is a chip of silicon, which provides the electrical equivalent of many transistors, resistors, and diodes, all interconnected to provide the desired function. But since NASA put in so many orders to buy integrated circuits, IBM started working on it. And because of the heavy demand, its price fell by more than 90% over the next 5 years. And so NASA tested whether we can rely on computers for the safety of human lives. If astronauts could go to the moon and back by relying on these computer chips, we can obviously rely on these computer chips for our daily lives. The technology grew exponentially after this moon landing. Even so, only 3 years after the Apollo 11 mission. In December 1972, the last moon mission, Apollo 17, took place. Since then, friends, it has been almost 50 years. No other person went to the moon during these 50 years. Perhaps this is the biggest proof about how expensive the Apollo program was. More than 400,000 engineers, scientists, and technicians had worked on it, and the total cost back then was $24 billion. In today's money, the cost is more than $100 billion. Initially, it was criticized by journalists only, but by 1972, the average person's fascination with NASA and the moon had ended. As the Vietnam War continued, the problems of the citizens were on the rise. Thousands of demonstrators opposed to the Vietnam War assembled in the nation's capital for a mass protest. They saw the space program as a waste of money. Even though NASA had plans for missions up to Apollo 20, politicians had to heed the citizens, and the money being spent on space programs had to be cut down. In December 2017, former President Donald Trump said that he would increase the funding so that humans could be sent back to the moon by 2020 for returning American astronauts to the moon for the first time since 1972, or long-term exploration and use this time. But later he changed his statement and said that NASA should focus on Mars rather than on the moon. But 50 years later, now NASA has made plans again to send people to the moon. Their new Artemis program. They would begin testing with unmanned rockets, but NASA plans that by 2025 to 2026 they would send the first woman to the moon. After which, they plan to send the first person of color to the moon as well. One thing can be said for sure, before the end of this decade, we will see humans back on the moon. Thanks for watching.